Welcome to the Fintech Founder Journey, the podcast that explores fintech and the founders that power it. We look at how to build better fintech products, better fintech businesses, and how to work on yourself to be more successful in all that you do. I'm your host, Mike Scott, and I'm also the co-founder and CEO of Nona Digital, an expert firm that consults on, designs, and develops software for fintech companies around the world. In today's show, Nona's co-founder and COO, Ed O'Reilly, joins me again, and this time we'll be talking about the team that you actually need to build a fintech product. This podcast is sponsored by ourselves, Nona Digital. We are an expert firm that consults on, designs, and develops fintech software, and we do it with a level of care and excellence that is rare and difficult to match. Working with us, you get access to a deeply skilled and experienced fintech design and development team with a particularly deep experience level in blockchain. You get the benefit of a team that is big enough for no key person dependencies to exist, but small enough so that you're always close to the principles. You get the benefit of our reusable component library, which means that we are able to launch your fintech product sooner than anyone else could at a comparable standard. To get in touch with one of our principals, to see how we could help your fintech project to accelerate and succeed, head over to Nona Digital to book a consultation directly. And now onto the show. So welcome, Ed. Good to have you back.
Thank you, Michael. It's good to be back. It's been a while.
It has been a while. Not since I saw you. I saw you a few minutes ago, but it's been a while since you've been on the podcast.
Yeah, so I want to jump straight in. Chosen me as someone worth speaking to.
So we've titled this episode, "What Team Do You Actually Need to Build Your FinTech App?" And I think it might be a good place to start by clarifying, what do we actually mean by app here? Give us a little rundown of app is a bit of a catch-all phrase. So what might we be discussing here? Are we only talking about mobile apps? Are we talking about desktop apps, dashboards? What are we talking about when we say, building your app?
Yeah, look, I think broadly this can cover most things. It could be an API that has no visual interface, providing services to other businesses. It could be a consumer-facing application for home loans or whatever it is. But for the context of the conversation to be nicely well-rounded, let's consider it together as something that has a visual interface. So it has a user interface. It requires design and a design team and user experience thinking. It's not just a set of documentation and developer APIs for some kind of open banking integration. Let's look at it as a consumer, but that consumer could be a business-based application where there's design required, there's product thinking, you're going to have users that use it, and a dev team required to power it. So for our context, let's talk about it like that.
Got it. Thanks for clearing that up, and hopefully that's useful and has set the context a bit. So the next thing I want to touch on, and this episode shouldn't be massively long. We can probably get through a lot of stuff relatively quickly, but I want to get through some more foundational stuff. So, in the lead up to this conversation, Ed and I were talking, and we were talking about just how many different roles there actually are. There's business analysts, there's product owners, there's project managers, there's Scrum Masters, there's all kinds of different developer titles and UXs and UIs, and it gets a bit overwhelming. So again, before we jump into how to build the team and what the optimal team is, why don't you just run us through the common roles that people are likely to hear about when they're assembling a team and what these roles mean at a glance, quickly?
Yeah, it's actually, to do it in anything less than a glance would take a really long time because there's so many different titles and distinctions that people have. So what I was thinking about for this is essentially you have a couple of sort of buckets of roles, right? So under development, you can have back-end engineers, DevOps engineers, site reliability engineers, front-end engineers, mobile developers, web developers, et cetera, But let's just bucket all of those as development, right? Then you're going to have a whole series of different design roles. So, these days it's quite important to do user experience research, then user experience design, then you have interaction designers, then you have graphic designers, then you have brand strategists, then you have, UI interface designers, etc. So I think given all of those distinctions and all the various buckets of roles involved in product development, I'll look at it as you get a development bucket that constitutes all those roles mentioned. You get a design bucket that constitutes all those roles I previously mentioned. Then you get a product bucket, which is sort of more again, a series of other roles that fits into that. But let's just look at it as there's a product bucket with your product owners, product managers, product strategists, etc. And then you have a sort of overall bucket for managing communications. The people that are running the team, keeping things on track, managing communications either internally or with a client. And then you have a testing bucket, sort of your quality assurance engineers, your quality assurance testers, etc. So those are the 5 main sort of buckets of roles. You need people in product, design, development, communication and management, and quality assurance. So those are the 5 sort of role categories that I consider for this.
And, most people listening to this podcast are probably not going to have a limitless budget and able to just kind of assemble absolutely everybody that they want onto their team. There's usually going to be some kind of constraints that they're working with. And, even though we work with some incredibly well-funded startups and businesses, they're still under constraints, right? Money is not just sort of limitless. So what are some of the things that we might be able to double up on here, Ed? So, does one role equal one human? Or can we get smart about this? And when you're assembling a team, can you kind of fill, for example, 3 roles with one human effectively? And I don't mean by giving them 3 jobs. I mean by giving them one job where they're able to tick off numerous boxes. Talk to me about how you can optimize the usage of people on a team.
Cool. Yeah. So, again, massive question, right? In terms of exactly what is valued. And to your earlier question around, when we say an app, what do we mean? Dashboards, etc. Right? So, a lot to say around this point, but let's touch on a couple of things. So firstly, if you're doing something that is a highly specialized application, like you're doing financial dashboards that need to be used to report on metrics in mining, etc., then obviously having someone that's got context on reporting financial information and creating dashboards of financial information that will be useful at the right tiers in a particular industry or organization is incredibly helpful. So you look at that on a product side. You're going to need somebody on a product side to develop a product. You're going to need somebody that understands who are the users, who are the customers, and what information do they actually need? What features do they actually need? But coming back to what you said about constraints, in most practical terms for, not a massive corporate or a limitless budget project, in most normal cases, that product role, although it could be very usefully augmented by people with sort of more long-term product development and product strategy experience, that's often your role as the founder, or your role as the project backer, or your role as the person on our client's side in our context. You need to be deciding what is it that's actually being built and for who, and therefore what features does it need. Now, that's not to say that you do so in isolation. You partner with a design team, a development team to help refine those concepts. But essentially, somebody needs to be responsible for the product direction, the product strategy, the actual features that are getting built, and in what order that they're getting built to deliver the most value. And to your question about sort of compositing roles together, in that space, you'll have product managers, product owners, VP of product, chief product officer, etc. But that can often be, in the case of a constrained budget project, a single person that's responsible for the product direction, what is getting built and for who, and that person is responsible for understanding the customer and what the customer's needs are and hypothesizing which features need to be developed to meet those customer needs. So I think essentially you need that one main product role there. So you're going to say something?
Yeah, so it's you're absolutely right. A lot of our clients, big and small, the founder or the CEO is effectively the product owner because they have the deepest knowledge of the landscape, of the users, of the problem they're trying to solve. And maybe as they scale, they bring other people in, but at least in the earlier stages and maybe beyond launch and while they're scaling it, it's often the founder. Something that comes up a lot is, in fact, I just got off a call with a company that's looking at hiring Nona. They've built a product. They've scaled this product. They're actually very successful. They don't have one single developer or designer in their business. They have outsourced absolutely everything from the word go, which actually really surprised me. This is a fintech startup. They've done very well. They're very smart. They understand the landscape, but they have never hired a single developer, designer, project manager, nothing. They've outsourced the entire thing. Talk to me about the risks of doing that. And let me just clarify this. We are a company that builds things for other people. And yet we generally believe you shouldn't outsource absolutely everything as you're scaling. There are certain roles that probably make sense to have in-house, but that's what I want to ask you. So when I say that to you, what are you thinking? Talk to me about the risks and sort of how to work with, which roles you want to start off internally and which ones you might want to augment as you go through building, launching, scaling, etc.
Yeah, man, look, I think in essence, that's totally fine. The part you probably don't want to majorly outsource is the part that they're handling, what we're talking about there now, the product ownership. They're deciding on the critical direction, on what gets built, on which features for which users. Now, not to say that you don't want to outsource that at all. When we work with our clients, we're facilitating that product experience quite a lot. We're providing a lot of insights from the hundreds of projects we've built, from the industry-specific knowledge, from understanding exactly what's happening and what's possible, to answer the questions around what should be built in what order, in what timeline, for who, etc. But essentially, that's the main part that I would assume you want to hang on to if you're a startup answering a particular problem or solving a particular problem, is exactly what problem are we solving, for who and for why. So I don't really see there being a problem with them outsourcing everything else. Obviously, you've got to trust the people you're outsourcing to massively if you're not going to have any technical knowledge in the business itself. So as a first role, what a lot of people would do is have the person on their side of the fence that's managing the outsourced partner. And it helps if the person on that side of the fence has a good technical understanding, understands, what is possible, what capabilities they should expect, what level of quality they should expect, roughly how long things should take, what team sizes are required, just to make sure you're not getting fleeced by someone. But to outsource all the rest of it, I think it can often make sense. In my context, there's often functions in our business that I'm happy to outsource entirely in terms of certain, sort of social media marketing or marketing roles, areas where we're not intent in developing expertise. It can often be more cost effective and safer to outsource that entire function than it is to hire in that function.
And it comes down to risk, right? So, to your point, if you can outsource all of that and hold the product knowledge yourself, that's great. And it's really just a question of, whatever you're outsourcing, you need to be thinking about what is the process, what is the policy, what is the risk in terms of, let's just call it IP. So very specific knowledge about the product. If that company folds or goes under, or if a particular person at that company that we've outsourced to leaves and takes all the sort of knowledge with them. And I'm not talking about having it stolen. I'm just talking about that person no longer working on your project. What is the hole that's being filled? So, you've really got me thinking about that. It's actually less about the people and more about being answered to that question is, if any of these people left or moved on, or we no longer had access to them, would we still know what's going on? Would we still understand the architecture? Would we still understand the integrations and how everything ties together? It's a good point that you made.
Yeah, and that's
I want to change gears a little bit here.
Yeah, sorry. That's why I say that one major representative on your side that can manage the outsource partner, because they'll be able to know, are things being documented at a level that we can take over from? Are things being architected in a manner that we understand and agree with, such that if you move partners, you're not left with some very specific knowledge where only developer X on that team actually understood what needs to be done when this particular case arrives, because everything's a bit of a spaghetti mess. And when this situation arrives, only this one guy knows that one part of the code. If you have the one person on your side that's making sure the documentation is up to standard, that there's a clear feature roadmap and that everything's well planned, that the architecture is something you agree with, then you maintain a lot of that control and ability and actually more flexibility to move between various partners or hire an internal team when you want to.
So that's a good segue into hiring a team, right? So there's a massive crunch on developer talent around the world at the moment. It's not a surprise. There's more capital flowing into tech startups, not just fintech, but everything. Developers are very hard to find. And even when you find them, it's hard to find very good and very experienced engineers and developers, whatever you call them. What I want to ask you and what I want you to talk about a little bit is, we talk about junior developers, we talk about full stack developers, we talk about senior developers, we talk about architects, we talk about team leads. What do these things mean? And obviously we're going to have our own definitions of them and you're going to have yours, which will differ to certain people listening to this. But what I want to understand more about, like defining what it means, but more like, how do you think about these different things? How do you think about a junior versus an architect? How do you think about a team lead versus a full stack in the context of assembling a team?
Yeah, totally. On this one, we've got some pretty detailed long form notes on what we consider the various tiers to be. Love to share them, love to talk about them. So anyone that wants to reach out to me, I'd love to argue about them. So go for it. But to keep this simple, I look at it in three very simple groupings. To me, a junior is someone who is still learning what the rules are. They're not entirely useless. We don't hire people at the sort of learning and know nothing stage at all. I mean, some companies do it at very, very early levels. But to me, a junior they're still learning the rules. They don't even know what all the rules are, but they are competent. They can do some things. Then your sort of standard developer or an intermediate developer, they've learned what most of the rules are. And they can follow the rules and they can implement the things. They can work with a database, they can work with a front end, they can set up a bit of a deployment pipeline, but they're following other people's rules and guidelines. They understand how to implement the rules. And a senior person is someone that is determining what the rules are. They're the ones that are finding out what is possible, what is new. This is how we should implement things based on understanding the actual the first principles. They're setting what the rules are. So those are my distinctions: learning the rules, following the rules, and setting the rules. And something I think is worth touching on here is that the senior title, there's a lot of title inflation, right? So a lot of people want to be called seniors. And a lot of people are then rewarded by the fact that they want to be called seniors by being called seniors within sort of 5 years into their career. And I think that's a big mistake that's sort of very prevalent in our industry right now. People just sort of throwing the senior title around. And what we've done to sort of consider mitigating that risk as well is just looking at, seniority is more than just skill and ability. There's a certain element of seniority that is actually just, time at the crease, runs on the board, years of experience, been there, seen that. So when we consider seniority, we look at no matter how good you are, obviously you have to be good to have the title, you need to have had that level of experience. And we consider that experience sort of around the 10-year mark before you can really call yourself a senior at something. You've done your 10,000 hours, you've done enough different types of projects, work on enough different types of stacks, code bases, languages, etc., that you're actually quite comfortable now. Something thrown at you, you're going to be able to handle it. There's not going to be a problem that you're not like, okay, cool, let me workshop that solution. So I think those are my main distinctions. Then architect is really just a form of senior that's comfortable putting together a whole project. Like, this is how everything should fit together. This API structure talking to, this client, etc. And a full stack developer is really just one that's comfortable across the back end and the front end and DevOps. Perhaps they're a generalist versus a specialist. Yeah.
So I'm going to come back to this a little later when we talk about sort of team makeups, but I know that you've got some pretty strong opinions on Scrum Masters. So what is a Scrum Master for the audience, and where do they make sense on a project, Ed?
Cool. So I have a lot of strong opinions about a lot of things, Mike. So I think let's look at it more as like agile overall rather than as a Scrum Master that I'm strongly opinionated about. But essentially, the problem for me, right, is that Agile was conceived as just a set of principles to avoid a particular workflow that involved a whole lot of upfront planning and documentation, and then a very rigid plan that was executed over a long period of time without scope for change. And a group of folks who were working in the software space met to try and change that old school way of working that they'd seen to be unsuccessful. And they wrote down a couple of principles, basically favoring individuals and team interactions over having like a set process that you follow or tools that you use, delivering actual working pieces of software rather than coming up with an incredibly rigid plan, responding to change, etc., etc. So they just came up with a set of guiding principles for how to manage software projects better. And then over the years, as tends to happen in business and industries, all of this stuff has been added and conflated into it. Now you get organizational agile and Scrum methodologies and all these roles that are supposed to have these very particular responsibilities. And Scrum Masters are one of those roles. And so a Scrum Master is particularly a person that facilitates the process of running Scrum teams. So agile software development following a Scrum methodology, they're the person that facilitates that whole process. They ensure the right meetings are happening, that the right people are rocking up to it, that the right information flow is happening, that the meetings are structured in the right way, that retrospectives are happening, and that people are learning from that, and that actionables bubble up and that they're executed upon. So when done correctly and in the right company, an incredibly valuable role. But in the case that we were talking about now, if you're constrained and you have a 2-person development team, and that is the development team, do you need a single individual's full-time role facilitating that whole process? Potentially not. If everybody in the team has 20 years software experience, has been working in an agile methodology, do they need that agile process facilitated for them? Potentially not. They could become a far better self-organizing team without that facilitation. But if you're new to an agile process and you have an 8-person large development team, it probably really helps to have someone ensuring that the rules are being stuck to, that the right meetings are happening, and facilitating that whole software development experience. So I think overall, things in agile have gone incredibly overwrought, and that generally sticking to the important basics is going to be better for most companies than having so many different roles with distinct titles and responsibilities, and hoping that that's expense around that is going to justify itself in the long term.
So Ed, we build products and projects for clients. So you don't have a huge amount of experience building teams on the, let's call it on the client side. Most of your experience, in fact, all of your experience is on building teams and building products for other people. So you're massively experienced in this, but the building teams part is more observation than experience when it comes to multiple different teams. I'm explaining myself badly here. We've built many, many teams within Nona, but not built teams for many clients. So I just want the listeners to understand that. So the question around this is, what are some of the mistakes that you see being made with people assembling and building teams in terms of inefficiencies, oversights, or just plain mistakes? And I guess we can talk about our mistakes as well, actually, because while we're not a product company, we certainly are building teams that build product. So oversights, inefficiencies, or flat out mistakes made when assembling a team to build a product, what are they?
We certainly make mistakes, Mike. My major one that I see most often is not having the right level of seniority in development, at least like a single person. So I've seen a lot of people build development teams where there's just no one that's actually a truly senior developer. And that leads to, incredibly bad architectures and effectively throwaway code at the end of the day. Because these projects sort of limp along, they get slower and slower and slower. Technical debt builds up. They're poorly architected. They're incredibly insecure. And big companies with big budgets and serious projects fall into that trap. So that's very common. Just not enough actual true depth in the senior team. People often try and build too much stuff before releasing. That's another very common problem. Just trying to get way too many features, thinking all of those features are necessary for a user base as opposed to releasing things early enough. Another very common problem is so many times, and we've been guilty of this in the past. Hopefully we're very seldom guilty of it now, if at all. But tracking stuff is actually quite tricky. And deciding what to track and what meaning it will have. I'm talking from an analytics perspective in an application or a web app. So being sure of what value you want to track and what actions you want to track in your application, and doing that at the very beginning, and always doing that so that you're getting the right information through to the app to be able to make the right decisions. So many people neglect tracking at the earlier stages. And then similar to both of those things relating to lack of tracking and junior teams is just building too much for the short term, and not having this sort of, using agile as an excuse to just build too much for the short term without planning enough and having the sort of longer term picture in mind that involves things like architecting and sticking to a particular pattern so that code change in future is cheap, so that maintenance is cheap. And also, not adding in tracking now in the beginning because we'll add it when it's needed, but then adding it down the line becomes very expensive. So having enough long-term enough view that you're doing the important things like proper automated deployment pipelines and tracking built in from day one, and specific architectural patterns that remain, and code standards, and making sure that you stick to that stuff always. Because 2 years in, it's going to pay, 5 months in and 2 years in, it's going to pay incredible dividends if there's a structure to follow as opposed to just a mess to deal with.
And we've seen that so many times, haven't we, where people have done things as best they could, but effectively they come and they go, God, we need help, and we need to throw this away and start again, and it's very expensive. And look, there is a strategy that actually works around that. Sometimes it's the right decision, but you need to go into it willingly and very clear about what you're doing and being deliberate about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not knocking moving fast or doing stuff that isn't perfect. You can move fast and do stuff that's not perfect and still follow like a basic plan. And so if you're going to be releasing something to users, and then you want to have some sense of how those users are using that thing so that you can use that information to build future features or change features or remove features or make any decision, you have to track stuff. So while moving fast is a good idea, I don't really think there's too much of an excuse for moving fast and without tracking. While moving fast is a good idea, I don't think there's too much of an excuse for moving fast without any standards. Establish the standards at the beginning and stick to them throughout the process. You don't move so fast that you're not tracking things and throwing away standards. Don't move so fast that you're not following any kind of architectural pattern that you've written down and thought about. Like the time spent thinking about documenting and implementing that stuff is going to pay itself off if your project succeeds. And if you're betting on the project succeeding, which I assume you're doing if you're paying money to develop it internally or externally, plan for it to succeed to some extent as well, no matter how fast you're moving.
So speaking of tracking and building teams and all of these things, there's an assumption that we're speaking to people that are not enormously technical. There might be some listeners that are very technical that are still getting value from this, but let's for a second just assume that we're speaking to people that might be slightly technical or not technical at all, but have very strong business acumen or subject matter expert or domain knowledge. You assemble a team, you listen to this podcast, you take some of our advice, you speak to us, you speak to other people, and you assemble a team. But you're not a qualified person you aren't qualified to assess the velocity, to assess the quality. What are some things, and I don't even know if you can answer this, because the answer might actually be get the right people on your team, but what are some things that you might want to be looking at to assess the quality and velocity of your team? You've assembled this team, but how are you kind of measuring if it's a good team? Like if you're not a developer, if you're not a technical person, how do you know you've assembled a good team?
Sure, hey. You don't know if you've assembled a good team, but the best metric to use in terms of how well is it going is actually just working software. So whoever you are and whatever team you assemble, make sure that the main deliverable, that the sort of key thing that's delivered is the thing back into your hand. So if you're building a mobile app, after every so often, ideally daily, but after every so often, you want to be seeing the next feature in progress, even in the application or on the website. If you're constantly seeing additions to the web app or the app that you can actually use and play with and experiment with, and you can submit the form, you can buy the thing, that will give you a very real sense of progress being made. So working software is really the barometer through which everything should be measured for every team that's delivering that as a service, right? You're going to want to see the actual proof in the pudding. And if you do see that regularly and you're happy, if the pudding is tasty, then no matter how crap the team might be, you're making progress in a demonstrable, meaningful, usable way. And that's probably the most important thing.
Yeah, so very complex and very difficult and very tricky to assemble, but relatively easy to measure, which is quite common, right? Get to that point is difficult, but the measurement is actually quite simple.
Yeah, well, tricky. I mean, the measurement at one level is simple because you're seeing the working software, but you don't know what's going on behind the scenes to get that working software. So if you have no technical internals that you trust, you might be digging yourself into a hole to get that working software. It might be a lot of smoke and mirrors. There might not actually be a transaction happening behind the scenes that's just faking so there could be all kinds of bullshit going on behind the scenes that you ideally do want to keep an eye on. But yeah, a very important measure is it works, it's in my hand, it's in the real world. Those are all sort of the most important thing. Next would be it's not a flaming pile of shit behind all of that.
So last sort of point that I want to raise, and then if there's anything else, we can discuss it afterwards. But now that we've been through sort of at a very high level, just touched on kind of, I wouldn't say everything, but all the sort of main themes around building a team. The next thing I wanted you to speak about is, when you come out the gates, it's unlikely you're going to have a massive budget. Even if you've raised $1 million or a couple of $1 million or whatever the case may be, a few $100,000, you're still not going to be you're going to be thrifty, and as you should be when you're building tech, until you really have hit product market fit and you're scaling and you just have tons of revenue and tons of funding. But let's assume you don't, right? Let's assume you're listening to this and you don't have unlimited budgets. You've got to build a team. You have built a team, but the team isn't necessarily optimized, or it hasn't even been built yet. How do you think, Ed, about which of these roles to prioritize given tighter budgets? We want all of them. We can't afford all of them. How do we prioritize these roles?
Yeah, cool. So in the like I spoke earlier in the previous analogy, right? You're fulfilling the product role. You can get as much help as you need there, but we're talking in a very constrained environment. You're fulfilling the product role, the product owner, product manager, whatever it is. You're responsible for understanding and translating the customer requirements into features that need to be developed. So that has to happen, but you can fulfill that role. Next, if it's anything that's going to be used by humans, you need some kind of design done. You probably can't do it without any design thinking or user experience thinking at all. But that role, again, in a very constrained environment, obviously it's ideal to have it long-term, full-time. That can be something for a simple MVP, for a single feature application that you do upfront as a separate arrangement. So you're going to need to decide what's being built. You're going to need to work with someone to create the visual interface for that thing to be built, ideally considering user experience and sort of competitors and ecosystem and all of that stuff. Then you're going to have decided what is to be built and what it will look and feel like. Your most important and probably crucial role, if you only get to pick one, is a developer as senior as you can afford. Ideally more developers, but one really senior developer is going to be better than two more junior or more intermediate developers. So that single developer, and again in that case, a less specialized, more generalist single developer. So if you don't have the developer, you're not going to actually get the software product into the market. That's critical. You can do the product role. You can probably skimp more on the design role for certain products than you can on actually having someone build it out. Next up, after a really, really great developer, particularly if it's going to be something that's used frequently by people and that aren't very technical, would be a very solid designer. And again, you can look at generalists for both of these roles. Obviously, senior generalists are quite expensive, as are senior specialized people, but someone that can do user experience thinking and great user flows and incredibly good looking, aesthetically and good feeling designs, that's going to be an expensive designer. And a really top tier engineer that's going to consider good architecture, standards, documentation, and deliver a lot of code, and the code will be good. That's going to be a very expensive developer hire. But those are the absolute critical ones. Then as you branch out, you're going to want to get more specialized people in each one of those roles, someone more specialized front end, back end, someone more specialized on deployment pipelines and DevOps in general, and ideally some incredible help on the product side. Your own product manager or product owner that can get stuck deep into customer research and particular features in other apps and how this feature should function to be better than existing features in other apps that your similar client base might be used to. So that's kind of how I'd build it up. You have to have the developer, as good a designer as you can, and then roll it out from there. And just to say quickly, that's stopping short of all of the other roles you're going to need in actually marketing and selling and getting a product to market. And that's a whole other bag. And that can often be more expensive than the development itself, depending on how many people you're trying to reach. Because you could also do all those sales and marketing yourself.
Yeah, super
if
important.
You're targeting. Yeah.
Super important to raise that, and it's something that I have to speak to potential clients all the time. Is sort of, it's always a conversation that we speak about is, what is your development budget for the next year? And then they sort of tell me, and then I say, some form of, well, I hope you've got double that to actually market the thing, because if you build it, they won't necessarily come. And I think that's where a lot of companies actually fall short. We're not marketers, so we can't speak too much to that. We've only been speaking about the product building side. So Ed, super good conversation, super useful, super practical. I'm pretty much done with the things that I wanted to ask and cover. But before we wrap up, is there anything that you want to share that we haven't covered? Anything that's jumped to mind while we've been talking? Or are you happy to end off on that note?
Be very intentional about what it is, who you're building for, right? Because to Mike's point, if you build it, they won't come. If you're trying to build a consumer-based application that needs to be used by thousands of people, that's a very different marketing challenge to if you're trying to build something that you yourself can take to 100 banks and see if they're interested in it once you've built. Depending on who you're building for, you might not actually have to build working software. You could take a business plan with a design, a set of screens, an idea. So be very, very sure about who you're building for and plan accordingly, given the whole sales effort, the marketing effort, and actually getting it into market and getting enough customers or users of it that you can decide what to do next. And I think quite often people don't really think about that point. They'll ask you to build a consumer-based application and have looked at their development budget and not have planned a really big marketing budget. And then, you might build an excellent product, but never get it in front of people to use.
It's super valuable conversation. Thanks for joining. It's always great. I always think I know most of these things coming into these conversations, but I've learned a lot today as well. So thanks for joining. Thanks for taking the time.
Thank you, Michael. It was fun.
To the listeners, I hope you got some value from today. I'm sure you did. If you're building a team or have built a team or thinking about building a team, there's a lot of practical stuff here. And you're welcome to reach out to discuss your fintech project with myself or with Ed or any one of the principals at Nona. So we invite you to do that. Just head over to www.nona.digital and you'll find the link to book a consultation. And I'll be back next week with another episode to explore the Fintech Founder Journey.